My hands were shaking as I sat in that leather chair, the cold November air seeping through the windows of Hayes and Associates law firm on Beacon Street. I kept my purse clutched tight in my lap, the same black purse Charles had bought me for her 30th anniversary 3 years ago. Everything in that room felt too big, too formal, too final. The mahogany table stretched between us like a canyon, and I could smell the musty scent of old law books mixed with the sharp cologne my son Andrew always wore. I'm Patricia Monroe, 61 years old, and I never thought I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office listening to my dead husband's will, while my own son looked at me like I was some kind of stranger he'd rather not acknowledge. Charles had been gone for 2 months now. 2 months since that heart attack took him while he was fixing the fence in our backyard in Brookline. 2 months of sleeping alone in our bed, of cooking for one person, of wondering what would happen to everything we'd built together over 34 years of marriage. Andrew sat across from me with his wife Melissa, both of them dressed like they were attending a board meeting instead of settling their father's estate. Andrew had his father's broad shoulders, but none of his warmth, and today his face was set in that hard expression I'd been seeing more and more since he married Melissa 5 years ago. She sat beside him in a designer suit that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. Her blonde hair pulled back so tight it made her look severe. Her manicured fingers drummed against the table as she whispered something in Andrew's ear that made his jaw clench. Mr. Leonard Hayes, our family lawyer for the past 15 years, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He was a thin man in his 70s with kind eyes, the kind of person Charles had trusted with everything important in our lives. Thank you all for coming today. I know this is difficult, but we need to go through Charles's last will and testament as he requested. My daughter Jennifer sat to my right, and I could feel her squeeze my hand gently. At 28 Chatham, she was 7 years younger than Andrew, and she'd always been my gentle child, the one who still called me every Sunday and remembered my birthday without being reminded. She worked as a teacher at the local elementary school and lived in a modest apartment in Cambridge with her boyfriend David. Today, she looked tired, her brown hair simply pulled back in a ponytail, wearing the same black dress she'd worn to her father's funeral. Before we begin, Mr. Hayes continued, I want to express my deepest condolences again. Charles was not only my client, but my friend, and I know how much he loved his family. I felt my throat tighten. Charles had loved his family, loved us all so much. He'd worked double shifts at the construction company for years to put Andrew through business school, had walked Jennifer down the aisle at her first school play when she was 6 because she was too nervous to go alone. He'd been the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday, who never missed a soccer game or school concert, who taught Andrew how to drive and Jennifer how to change a tire. Now, Mr. Hayes said, opening the thick folder in front of him, let's begin with the reading of the will. As he started reading the legal language about Charles being of sound mind and body when he prepared the document, I found myself studying my son's face. When had he become so cold? When had that little boy who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms turned into this stranger who barely looked at me anymore? The first part of the will was standard, funeral arrangements, which had already been carried out, and some small bequests to Charles's brother and sister. Then Mr. Hayes got to the main provisions. To my beloved daughter Jennifer, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my collection of first edition books, knowing she will treasure them as I have. Jennifer gasped softly beside me, tears filling her eyes. She'd always loved reading, just like her father. Charles had spent years collecting those books, and I knew how much it meant to her that he'd remembered. To my son Andrew, I leave the vacation cabin in New Hampshire and $100,000, with the hope that he will use the cabin to create happy memories with his own family, as we did with ours. I saw Andrew's face brighten slightly. That cabin meant a lot to our family. We'd spent every summer there when the kids were growing up, teaching them to fish and swim, having barbecues and telling stories around the campfire. Charles had always talked about how he wanted it to stay in the family. And to my beloved wife Patricia, the woman who has been my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life for 34 years, I leave the remainder of my estate, including our family home, the remaining savings accounts, and my shares in Monroe Construction Company. The room fell silent except for the sound of traffic outside and the distant hum of the heating system. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Charles had taken care of me, just like he'd promised he would. The house was ours, mine now, and I wouldn't have to worry about where I'd live or how I'd manage financially. The construction company shares meant I'd have some income, and Charles had always been careful with money. But then I looked across the table and saw something in Andrew's face that made my stomach drop. His face had gone red, and his hands were clenched into fists on the table. "That's it," he said, his voice sharp and loud in the quiet room. Mr. Hayes looked up, surprised. "I'm sorry. That's all I get. A cabin and 100,000. Andrew's voice was getting louder, and I could see the vein in his temple that always pulsed when he was angry, just like it used to when he was a little boy having a tantrum. "Meanwhile, she gets everything else. The house, the business, the savings." "Andrew," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't what, Mom? Don't point out that this is completely unfair." He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "Dad worked his whole life to build that company, and now you're just going to take it over. What do you know about running a construction business?" My cheeks burned with embarrassment. Mr. Hayes was watching this uncomfortable scene unfold, and I could see Jennifer looking mortified beside me. But Andrew wasn't done. "This is exactly what I expected from someone your age," he continued, and I felt like he'd slapped me. "Greedy and old, that's what you are. You can't just be satisfied with a comfortable retirement. You have to take everything, don't you?" The words hit me like physical blows. Greedy and old, my own son, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, the child I'd rocked to sleep and nursed through childhood illnesses, the boy I'd cheered for at every baseball game and graduation, was calling me greedy and old in front of everyone. Melissa reached over and put a hand on Andrew's arm, but instead of calming him down, she seemed to encourage him. "He's right, Patricia," she said, her voice sweet, but with an edge that cut through me. "It does seem unfair that someone who's never worked in the business would inherit controlling interest. Maybe we should contest this will." I felt my world tilting. Contest the will. These were Charles's wishes, his final decisions about what he wanted to happen to everything we'd built together. But looking at their faces, I realized they'd probably been planning this conversation for weeks, maybe even months. "I think," Mr. Hayes said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension, "we should all take a breath and remember that we're here to honor Charles's wishes, not to argue about them." But Andrew wasn't listening. He was pacing now, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. "You know what, Mom? I'm done pretending this is okay. You've been manipulating Dad for years. Probably made him change the will when he was sick and not thinking clearly. Andrew, that's enough." Jennifer finally spoke up, her voice shaking. "How can you talk to Mom like that? Stay out of this, Jenny," Andrew snapped. "You got your little inheritance, so you're happy. But some of us actually cared about what Dad built, about carrying on his legacy. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to sink through the floor of that office and never have to face the hatred in my son's eyes again. This wasn't how Charles would have wanted this to go. This wasn't how any of us should be treating each other just 2 months after losing the man we all claimed to love." Mr. Hayes was shuffling through his papers, and I could tell he was as uncomfortable as I was. He'd known our family for so many years, had seen us through house purchases and business deals and wills and trusts. He'd never seen us like this. "Actually," he said slowly, and something in his tone made everyone stop and look at him. "Before we continue this discussion, there's something else." Andrew stopped pacing. Melissa leaned forward in her chair. Jennifer squeezed my hand tighter. "Something else?" I managed to ask. Mr. Hayes was looking through the pages of the will, and then he reached into his folder and pulled out what looked like another document. Charles left specific instructions that this wasn't to be opened until after the main will had been read and, well, until any initial reactions had been expressed. He held up a sealed envelope, and I could see Charles's handwriting on the front, to be opened only after initial will reading, final provisions and explanations. My heart started beating faster. A sealed envelope? Charles had never mentioned anything about sealed envelopes or additional provisions to me. In all our conversations about the will, all his assurances that I'd be taken care of, He'd never said anything about hidden documents. "What is that?" Andrew demanded, but his voice had lost some of its earlier anger and now sounded uncertain. "This," Mr. Hayes said carefully, "appears to be a final page to the will, with additional provisions that Charles wanted kept sealed until this moment." The room fell completely silent. Outside, I could hear a siren in the distance and the sound of someone honking their car horn. But inside that office, nobody even seemed to be breathing. I stared at that envelope in Mr. Hayes's hands and felt a strange mixture of hope and terror. Charles had left something else, something he'd wanted to keep secret until now. But what could it be? And why had he felt the need to hide it from all of us? Mr. Hayes looked at each of us carefully before breaking the seal on that envelope. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, as if he understood that whatever was inside might change everything. The sound of the paper tearing seemed unnaturally loud in that quiet room, and I found myself holding my breath. "Charles gave me very specific instructions about this," he said, unfolding what appeared to be several pages of handwritten text. "He said I was to read this aloud, word for word, after the initial will had been read, and after any family discussions had taken place." I could see Andrew shift uncomfortably in his seat. Melissa's perfectly manicured fingers had stopped drumming against the table, and she was staring at the lawyer with an expression I couldn't quite read. Jennifer's hand was still gripping mine, and I could feel her pulse racing through her palm. Mr. Hayes adjusted his glasses and began to read in Charles's words. "If you're hearing this additional section, it means my family has just learned about my will, and I suspect there may have been some strong reactions. Patricia, my darling wife, I hope you're not too upset by whatever has been said. I need you to know that every decision I made was carefully considered, and everything I'm about to explain will make sense soon." Hearing Charles's words in Mr. Hayes's voice was like having him in the room with us. I could almost see him sitting at our kitchen table, writing these words by hand the way he always did when something was really important to him. He never trusted computers for the things that mattered most. "First, let me address my son Andrew directly. Son, I know you're probably angry right now. I know you expected to inherit more, and I know you're probably questioning your mother's role in all of this. But what you don't know is that for the past 2 years, I've been watching and listening, and I've learned some things that broke my heart." Andrew's face went pale. Melissa reached over and grabbed his arm. But this time, it didn't look supportive. It looked desperate. Mr. Hayes continued reading. "Andrew, in March of 2022, I was in the office late one evening, finishing up paperwork in the back room, when you came in with Melissa. You thought the building was empty, and you didn't know I was there. I heard you talking on your phone with someone about the old man's business, and how you couldn't wait for me to kick the bucket, so you could modernize everything and get rid of what you called dead weight." I watched my son's face crumble as he realized what his father was saying. That conversation had happened. Andrew looked like he might be sick, but that wasn't the worst part, son. The worst part was when you told whoever you were talking to that once you inherited the business, the first thing you'd do was put your mother in some kind of home because she'd be too old and confused to manage on her own. You laughed when you said it, Andrew. You laughed about putting the woman who raised you into a nursing home so you could take over her life completely. The room felt like all the air had been sucked out of it. I stared at Andrew, unable to process what I was hearing. Put me in a home. He'd been planning to put me in a nursing home. I was 61 years old, in perfect health, sharp as a tack, and my own son had been planning to declare me incompetent. "Mom, Andrew started, but Mr. Hayes held up his hand. "There's more," the lawyer said gently. "Charles wanted this read in full," he continued. "I confronted you about this conversation the next day, Andrew, and instead of apologizing or explaining, you doubled down. You told me that Mom would be better off somewhere with professional care, that running a business was too stressful for someone her age, that you were just looking out for her best interests. But we both know that wasn't true. You wanted her out of the way so you could sell the family home, liquidate the business assets, and move on with your life without having to worry about taking care of your aging parents." I felt like I was going to throw up. All those family dinners over the past 2 years, All those times Andrew had seemed distant or impatient with me. All those conversations where he'd made little comments about how I should take it easy or not worry about business matters. It had all been leading up to this. He'd been planning to have me declared incompetent and locked away. Jennifer was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her face. "Andrew," she whispered, "how could you?" But Andrew wasn't looking at her or at me. He was staring at the table, his face red with shame and anger. Mr. Hayes's voice continued with Charles's words. "So I made some changes, son. I met with 3 different doctors and had complete cognitive and physical evaluations. I have documentation proving that I was of completely sound mind when I made these decisions. I also hired a private investigator to document some other things I suspected about your plans for the family assets." Melissa went completely white. "What kind of documentation?" she asked in a voice that came out as barely a whisper. "I'm glad you asked, Melissa," Mr. Hayes read, and I could almost hear Charles's dry sense of humor in the words. "Because the investigator discovered that you've been meeting with real estate agents for the past 6 months, getting appraisals on the family home, and discussing the best way to quickly liquidate what you called a dated property in a good neighborhood. You also met with a business broker about selling Monroe Construction to the highest bidder, preferably to one of our competitors." Melissa's carefully composed facade finally cracked. "That's not... We were just exploring options." "Let me finish," Mr. Hayes said firmly, and continued reading. "The investigator also discovered that you've already researched several assisted living facilities in the area and had conversations with administrators about emergency placement for elderly family members who might need immediate care due to sudden cognitive decline. You specifically asked about the process for moving someone quickly if their family had power of attorney." I couldn't breathe. They hadn't just been planning to steal my inheritance. They'd been planning to have me declared incompetent and locked away while they sold everything Charles and I had built together, everything we'd worked for, everything we'd saved, everything we'd planned for our retirement. They were going to take it all and leave me in some institution. "This is why," Mr. Hayes read, "I've made different arrangements. Patricia, my beloved wife, you are inheriting everything because you deserve it, and because I know you'll honor the life we built together. But more importantly, you're inheriting it because I want to make sure you're protected from the people who were planning to take advantage of you." Andrew suddenly stood up, his chair flying backward. "This is insane," he shouted. "Dad was paranoid in his last years. Everyone knows that. He was seeing conspiracies everywhere." "Sit down, Andrew," Mr. Hayes said in a voice that carried absolute authority. "I'm not finished reading your father's words." Andrew remained standing, but he stopped talking. "I know this is painful to hear, son, but I need you to understand the consequences of your choices. The cabin in New Hampshire and the $100,000 I've left you is more than generous, considering what you are planning to do to your mother. However, there are conditions attached to these inheritances that I haven't mentioned yet." "Conditions?" I looked up at Mr. Hayes, confused. "The cabin will only transfer to you if you sign a legally binding document promising that you will never attempt to have your mother declared incompetent, that you will never try to convince her to sell the family business or home, and that you will never contact any assisted living facilities on her behalf without her explicit written request. If you violate any of these conditions, the cabin will be sold, and the proceeds will go to the American Heart Association." Andrew's face was purple now. "He can't do that. You can't put conditions like that on an inheritance." "Actually," Mr. Hayes said calmly, "he can, and he did. Your father was very thorough in his legal research." He turned back to the document. "The $100,000 comes with similar conditions, plus one additional requirement. You must write a letter to your mother, apologizing for the pain you've caused and the plans you made, and you must read this letter aloud to her in the presence of a witness. If you cannot bring yourself to do this, the money will go to Jennifer instead." The room was completely silent, except for the sound of Andrew's heavy breathing and Jennifer's quiet sniffling. I sat there trying to process everything I'd just learned. My son, the baby I'd nursed and raised and loved unconditionally, had been planning to betray me in the cruelest way possible, and my husband, the man I'd lived with for over 30 years, had known about it and had been quietly protecting me. "There's one more thing," Mr. Hayes said softly, looking directly at me. "Patricia, Charles left you a personal letter It's separate from the will, and you can read it privately when you're ready." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Charles's familiar handwriting. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Melissa finally found her voice again. "This is all lies," she said, but her voice was weak and desperate now. Charles was sick. He was confused. He probably imagined half of these conversations. "Actually," Mr. Hayes interrupted, reaching into his folder again. Charles anticipated that response as well. He left me recordings. He pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on the table. This contains audio of several conversations, legally recorded in Charles's own office, where he had every right to record. He's documented everything he's claimed in this letter. Andrew sank back into his chair, like all the fight had gone out of him. Melissa was staring at the recorder as if it were a snake that might bite her. I looked around that conference room at my family, what was left of it, and felt a strange mixture of devastation and relief. Devastation because I just learned that my oldest child had been planning to destroy my life, but relief because Charles had known, had protected me, had made sure I wouldn't be left vulnerable and alone. "I think," I said quietly, my voice hoarse from the emotions churning inside me, "I'd like to go home now." Jennifer immediately stood up. "I'll drive you, Mom." Andrew looked up at me, and for just a moment, I saw a flash of the little boy he used to be, the child who would run to me when he was scared or hurt. "Mom, not now, Andrew," I said, standing on unsteady legs. "I can't. I need time to think about all of this." As I walked toward the door, Mr. Hayes called after me. "Mrs. Monroe, we'll need to schedule another meeting to handle the paperwork for the property transfers and business documentation, but that can wait until you are ready." I nodded without turning around. Jennifer took my arm and guided me out of that office, leaving Andrew and Melissa sitting at that mahogany table with their shattered plans and exposed secrets. As we walked down Beacon Street toward Jennifer's car, I clutched Charles's letter to my chest and wondered how I was going to face the rest of my life, knowing what I now knew about my own son. The drive back to my house in Brookline felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes. Jennifer drove in silence while I stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar streets blur past. Everything looked the same coffee shop where Charles and I used to have breakfast on Sundays, the same park where we'd taken the kids when they were little, the same tree-lined streets we'd walked together for over 3 decades. But everything felt different now, like I was seeing it all through different eyes. When we pulled into my driveway, I just sat there for a moment, looking at the house Charles and I had bought when Andrew was 5 and Jennifer was just a baby. It was a modest colonial with blue shutters and a white picket fence, nothing fancy, but it had been our dream home. Charles had painted those shutters every few years, and I'd planted the garden that was now dormant for winter. We'd raised our children here, celebrated birthdays and holidays, worried about mortgage payments, and celebrated when we finally paid it off. Now I knew that my own son had been planning to take it all away from me. "Mom," Jennifer said softly, "do you want me to come in with you?" I looked at my daughter, this sweet young woman who looked so much like I had at her age, and felt my heart break a little more. At least I still had her. At least one of my children still loved me. "Yes," I said. "I think I'd like that." We walked up the front steps together, and I fumbled with my keys. My hands were still shaking, and Jennifer had to help me get the door open. Inside, the house felt too quiet, too empty. Charles's coffee cup was still sitting on the kitchen counter from the morning he died, and I'd never had the heart to wash it and put it away. Jennifer made tea while I sat at the kitchen table, Charles's letter still clutched in my hands. The envelope was worn now from my gripping it so tightly, and I could see that Charles had written, "My dearest Patricia," on the outside beneath my name. "Mom," Jennifer said, setting a steaming mug in front of me. I had no idea about Andrew, about any of their plans. I swear I didn't know. I looked up at her, at this daughter who had always been my sunshine child, the one who still brought me flowers from her garden and called me whenever she saw something that reminded her of me. "I know you didn't, sweetheart. You're nothing like your brother." She sat down across from me, the same way she used to when she was little and wanted to talk about something important. "Are you going to read Dad's letter?" I turned the envelope over in my hands. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately, desperate to hear more of Charles's words, to feel close to him again. But another part of me was terrified of what else he might have discovered, what other painful truths he might reveal. "I think I need to," I said finally, "but I'm scared. I'll stay with you while you read it if you want." I nodded and carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 3 pages of Charles's neat handwriting, the same careful script he'd used to write me love notes when we were dating, the same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists and Christmas tags for 34 years. "My dearest Patricia," I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. "If you're reading this, then the worst has happened. I'm gone, and you've just learned some terrible truths about our son. I'm so sorry you had to find out this way, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you what I'd discovered while I was still alive to help you through it." I paused, wiping my eyes with a tissue Jennifer handed me. "The truth is, I didn't want to hurt you while we still had time together. I wanted our last months to be filled with love and happiness, not with the pain of knowing what Andrew had become. I hoped that somehow I was wrong, that maybe I'd misunderstood his intentions, but the evidence kept mounting." Jennifer reached across the table and took my free hand. "I want you to know that none of this is your fault, my darling. We raised Andrew with love and values and everything we thought was right. Sometimes children make choices that break their parents' hearts, and there's nothing we could have done differently. You were a wonderful mother, and you are a wonderful woman who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." I had to stop reading for a moment because I was crying too hard to see the words. Jennifer got up and sat in the chair next to me, putting her arm around my shoulders. "Take your time, Mom." After a few minutes, I continued, "I've made sure you're financially secure, but more than that, I've made sure you're protected from people who would take advantage of your generous heart. The business is yours now, and I've arranged for my foreman, Tommy Rodriguez, to help you manage it if you want to keep it running, or to help you sell it fairly if you decide that's what you want to do. Tommy is a good man who's worked for us for 15 years, and he knows the business inside and out." I remembered Tommy, a quiet, hard-working man in his 40s who had always been respectful and kind whenever I'd visited the office. Charles had mentioned several times over the years that Tommy was the most reliable employee he'd ever had. "The house is yours, free and clear, and there's enough money in savings and investments to keep you comfortable for the rest of your life. You never have to depend on anyone else for anything, Patricia. You're strong and smart and capable, and don't let anyone, including our son, tell you otherwise." I thought about all those subtle comments Andrew had made over the past few years, all those little suggestions that I was getting forgetful, or that business matters were too complicated for me to understand. Had Charles noticed those too? "I know this is going to be incredibly painful, and I wish I could be there to hold you while you work through it. But I need you to know that you're going to be okay. You're going to be more than okay. You're going to be free to live your life on your own terms, without anyone trying to control you or manipulate you or make decisions for you." The next paragraph was harder to read because Charles's handwriting got a little messier, as if his emotions had gotten the better of him while he was writing. "I'm angry, Patricia. I'm angry that our son turned out to be the kind of man who would plot against his own mother. I'm angry that he married a woman who encouraged his worst instincts instead of his best ones. I'm angry that I won't be there to protect you from their greed and their lies. But mostly, I'm angry that they made me question everything I thought I knew about the family we built together." Jennifer was crying now too, quiet tears dripping onto her lap. But then I think about Jennifer, and I remember that we did something right. We raised one child who has your compassion and kindness, who calls you regularly and genuinely cares about your happiness. We raised one child who will never see you as a burden or an obstacle to their own success. Hold on to that, my love. Hold on to Jennifer, and let her help you through this." I looked at my daughter, this woman who had driven me home and made me tea, and was sitting here sharing my pain, and felt a surge of gratitude so strong it almost overwhelmed me. "Finally," I continued reading, "I want you to live, Patricia, really live. We spent so many years working and saving and planning for the future, and now that future is here. Travel if you want to. You always talked about seeing Ireland and Italy. Learn something new. Take that art class you mentioned. Make new friends. Date someone if you meet someone who makes you happy. I know that sounds strange, but I mean it. You're only 61 years old, and you have so much life left to live. The idea of dating someone else seemed impossible right now, but I could hear Charles's voice so clearly in those words, could picture him sitting across from me with that gentle smile he'd get when he was trying to convince me to do something fun. Don't let Andrew's betrayal make you bitter or fearful. Don't let it stop you from trusting people or opening your heart to new experiences. You have so much love to give, and the world needs more people like you in it. The letter was almost finished, and I could barely get the words out through my tears. I love you, Patricia Monroe. I have loved you since the day I met you at that church dance when you were 19 years old and wearing that blue dress with the tiny flowers on it. I loved you when you walked down the aisle toward me in your grandmother's wedding dress. I loved you when you gave birth to our children and when you stayed up all night nursing them through fevers. I loved you when we had to stretch every dollar to make ends meet, and I loved you when things got easier. I love you now, and I will love you always. You are the best person I have ever known, and I am so grateful that I got to spend 34 years as your husband. Now go live a beautiful life, my darling. You deserve every happiness this world has to offer. Oh, my love, always and forever, Charles. I sat there holding those pages, crying so hard I could barely breathe. Jennifer was crying too, and we held each other in that quiet kitchen, while the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Charles had washed just a week before his heart attack. "Mom," Jennifer said finally, "what are you going to do about Andrew?" I wiped my eyes and looked at my daughter. What was I going to do about Andrew? The son who had planned to have me declared incompetent and locked away. The son who had married a woman who saw me as an obstacle to be removed. The son who had been counting on his father's death so he could take control of everything. I don't know, I said honestly. I honestly don't know. But even as I said it, I could feel something changing inside me. The shock and pain were still there, but underneath them was something else, something that felt like strength. Charles had protected me, had made sure I would be safe and secure. He'd given me choices and freedom and the means to make my own decisions about my life. For the first time since that awful scene in the lawyer's office, I felt like maybe I was going to be okay after all. The phone rang then, interrupting my thoughts. Jennifer looked at me questioningly. Should I answer it? I looked at the caller ID and saw Andrew's name. My heart started beating faster. "No," I said, surprising myself with how firm my voice sounded. "Let it go to voicemail. I'm not ready to talk to him yet." Jennifer nodded and squeezed my hand. "Good for you, Mom. You don't have to talk to anyone until you're ready." As the phone stopped ringing, I felt another small surge of that new strength. I didn't have to answer the phone if I didn't want to. I didn't have to make decisions about forgiveness or family relationships right now. I didn't have to do anything except take care of myself and figure out what I wanted my life to look like going forward. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was truly in control of my own destiny. 3 days passed before I finally listened to Andrew's voicemail. Jennifer had stayed with me those first 2 nights, sleeping in her old bedroom and making sure I ate actual meals instead of just picking at crackers and tea. By Thursday morning, I was starting to feel more like myself, still hurt, still angry, but stronger somehow, more determined. I was sitting in Charles's favorite chair in the living room, the one by the window where he used to read the morning paper, when I finally pressed play on the answering machine. "Mom, it's me." Andrew's voice sounded strained, tired. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me right now, but we need to discuss what happened at the lawyer's office. There are things you don't understand about the business, about the financial situation. Dad may have misunderstood some conversations. Please call me back. We're family, Mom. We need to stick together." I stared at the machine for a long moment after his voice stopped. Even now, even after being completely exposed, he was still trying to manipulate me, still suggesting that Charles had been confused, that I didn't understand business matters, that I needed him to take care of things for me. The phone rang again, and this time it was a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Monroe, this is Tommy Rodriguez from Monroe Construction. I'm so sorry to bother you at home, but I wanted to reach out after what happened with Mr. Hayes the other day. Tommy, Charles had mentioned him in his letter." I felt a flutter of nervousness. I'd only met Tommy a handful of times over the years when I'd stop by the office to bring Charles lunch or pick up paperwork. "Hello, Tommy. Thank you for calling. Mrs. Monroe, I just wanted you to know that if you decide to keep the business running, I'm here to help however you need. Mr. Charles, he talked to me a few months before he passed. Told me he was making some changes and that you might need support with the company operations." I felt a wave of gratitude toward my husband. Even in those final months, when he was dealing with his own health problems and the devastating knowledge of Andrew's betrayal, he'd been thinking ahead, making sure I wouldn't be left to navigate the business world alone. "Tommy, can I ask you something? Did you know about Andrew's plans for the company?" There was a long pause. "Mrs. Monroe, I don't like to speak ill of family, but yes, I knew some things. Andrew came by the office several times over the past year, asking questions about the client list, the contracts, the equipment values. He told me he was just trying to understand the business better, but the questions he was asking, they were the kind of questions someone asks when they're planning to sell." My stomach dropped. "Sell the entire business?" "Yes, ma'am. And not to someone who would keep the employees or maintain the reputation your husband built. Andrew was asking about liquidation values, about how quickly contracts could be transferred. He asked me not to mention these conversations to Mr. Charles." I closed my eyes, feeling another wave of betrayal wash over me. Charles had built Monroe Construction from nothing, starting with just a pickup truck and a toolbox when Andrew was a baby. He'd worked 16-hour days, taken on dangerous jobs, built relationships with contractors and suppliers throughout Boston. The company wasn't just a business. It was his legacy, his life's work. "Tommy, what would you recommend?" "About the business, I mean, well, ma'am, we've got good contracts lined up through next spring, and the crew is solid. Your husband trained good people, and we all respected him. If you want to keep things running, I can handle the day-to-day operations, and you can decide how involved you want to be. If you want to sell eventually, we can do it the right way, to someone who will take care of the employees and honor the contracts." For the first time since Charles's death, I felt hopeful about something. "Tommy, could we meet? Maybe you could show me around the office. Explain how things work." "Of course, Mrs. Monroe. Would tomorrow morning work for you?" After I hung up, I sat in Charles's chair and looked around our living room. Everything in this house told the story of our life together. The photos from vacations, the handmade Christmas ornaments the kids had made in school, the bookshelf Charles had built himself when we couldn't afford to buy one. This was my home, my life, my history, and I'd almost lost it all because my own son saw it as nothing more than assets to be liquidated. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the front window, I could see a familiar figure on my front porch. Andrew. My heart started pounding. I wasn't ready for this conversation, wasn't ready to face him, but he'd seen my car in the driveway, and he was obviously not going to leave. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "Hello, Andrew." He looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was disheveled. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. For a moment, he looked like the little boy he used to be, the one who would come to me when he'd gotten in trouble at school or had a fight with a friend. "Mom, please, can we talk?" I stepped aside and led him into the foyer, but I didn't go any farther into the house. This conversation was going to happen right here, by the front door, where I could ask him to leave whenever I wanted to. "I know you're angry," he started, but Dad was sick toward the end. "Mom, you know he was. His thinking wasn't clear." "Stop!" The word came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was tired of hearing him say that Charles had been confused. "Your father was perfectly clear. Andrew, Dr. Peterson confirmed that Charles had no cognitive issues right up until the day he died." Andrew's face flushed. "Look, maybe I said some things I shouldn't have. Maybe Melissa and I discussed some options that we shouldn't have considered. But we were worried about you, Mom, about what would happen to you if you couldn't manage everything on your own. You were planning to have me declared incompetent and put in a nursing home." I said the words slowly, clearly, wanting him to hear exactly what he'd done. "You were going to take my house, sell your father's business, and lock me away somewhere so you wouldn't have to be bothered with me. That's an extreme interpretation of, it's exactly what you were planning, and we both know it." I felt that new strength rising in me again. The same feeling I'd had when I refused to answer his phone calls. Andrew, you're my son, and I will always love you, but I don't trust you anymore. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again. His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might actually apologize, might actually show some genuine remorse for what he'd put me through. Instead, he got angry. This is ridiculous, Mom. You're 61 years old. You've never worked a real job. You don't know anything about running a business. What are you going to do? Play office? Pretend you understand construction contracts and payroll and insurance? The condescending tone in his voice was like a slap in the face. Here it was again. The assumption that I was too old, too stupid, too fragile to manage my own life. I'm going to learn, I said quietly. I'm going to meet with Tommy Rodriguez tomorrow, and I'm going to figure out how to run the business your father left me. And if I decide I can't handle it, I'll sell it to someone who will treat the employees fairly and honor your father's reputation. Tommy Rodriguez. Andrew's voice rose. Mom, he's just a foreman. He doesn't have the education or the business background to what? To be trusted with your father's company. The company he helped build for the past 15 years. I could feel my anger building now, clean and righteous. Tommy Rodriguez has more integrity in his little finger than you've shown in the past 2 years. Andrew's face went red. I'm your son. I'm family. You're going to trust some employee over your own flesh and blood. My own flesh and blood was planning to betray me in the worst possible way, I said, my voice steady despite the pain in my chest. My own flesh and blood looked at his grieving mother and saw nothing but an obstacle to be removed. We stared at each other across the foyer, and I saw the exact moment when Andrew realized that his manipulation wasn't working anymore. His expression shifted from fake concern to cold calculation. Fine, he said. You want to play businesswoman. Go ahead, but when you fail, and you will fail, don't come crying to me for help, and don't expect me to bail you out when you lose everything Dad worked for. I won't need your help, Andrew. And if I do fail, at least I'll fail on my own terms, not because someone I trusted stabbed me in the back. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. What about my inheritance? The cabin and the money? Are you going to honor Dad's will? Or are you going to try to contest that too? I thought about Charles's conditions, the apology letter, the promises not to interfere with my life, the legal protections he'd built in. That's up to you, I said. Your father left very specific instructions about what you need to do to receive your inheritance. If you can't meet those conditions, then you don't deserve it. After he left, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. But underneath the adrenaline and hurt, I felt something else. Pride. I'd stood up to him. I'd refused to let him intimidate me or make me doubt myself. I'd chosen to trust a man my husband had respected over a son who had lost my trust completely. I walked back to Charles's chair and picked up the business card Tommy had given me months ago when he'd done some work on our back fence. Tomorrow, I would drive to Monroe Construction and start learning about the business my husband had built. I would figure out how to read contracts and manage payroll and deal with suppliers. I would prove to myself and to anyone else who doubted me that Patricia Monroe was perfectly capable of running her own life. For the first time since Charles's death, I felt excited about the future instead of afraid of it. That evening, Jennifer came by with takeout from my favorite Chinese restaurant. How are you doing, Mom? You sounded different on the phone today. I feel different, I said, and realized it was true. I feel like myself again, like the person I was before I started doubting everything about my own judgment and capabilities. We ate lo mein and talked about the business, about Tommy, about what it might be like for me to take on this new challenge. Jennifer listened without judgment, offering support and encouragement instead of the worried concerns I might have expected. I'm proud of you, Mom, she said as she was getting ready to leave. Dad would be proud too. After she left, I sat in the quiet house and thought about Charles's letter, about his encouragement to really live my life. Taking over the business felt like the first step in that direction, not just surviving as his widow, but thriving as Patricia Monroe, businesswoman and independent woman. I was still scared, still hurt by Andrew's betrayal, still grieving my husband's death, but I was also determined and hopeful and ready to find out what I was truly capable of when I stopped letting other people define my limitations. 6 months later, I was standing in the office of Monroe Construction at 7 in the morning, reviewing the day's work schedules with Tommy and our crew leaders. The office that had once felt foreign and intimidating now felt like a second home. I knew every file cabinet, every piece of equipment, every client's story. I knew which suppliers gave us the best deals and which ones tried to shortchange us. I knew the names of all 12 employees and their families, their strengths and their struggles. More importantly, I knew that I was good at this. "Mrs. Monroe," Tommy said, hanging up the phone. "That was the Hendersons. They want to add a deck to that kitchen renovation we're finishing up next week." "Good," I said, making a note in the project file. "That'll keep the crew busy through the end of June. Make sure we get the permits filed by Friday." It amazed me how naturally the business language came now. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have known the difference between a building permit and a business license. Now I was reading architectural plans and negotiating with subcontractors like I'd been doing it my whole life. The past 6 months had been the hardest and most rewarding of my life. Learning to run the business had been challenging, but not impossible. Tommy had been patient and thorough, teaching me everything from reading blueprints to managing cash flow. The crew had been respectful and helpful, and I'd gradually earned their trust by listening to their concerns and making decisions that benefited everyone. But the personal challenges had been even greater. Andrew had never written the apology letter Charles's will required. Instead, he'd hired a lawyer and tried to contest the will, claiming his father had been mentally incompetent when he wrote it. The case had been thrown out within 2 months when Charles's medical records and the audio recordings proved beyond any doubt that he'd been of sound mind. Andrew had lost his inheritance. The cabin had been sold, and the proceeds had gone to the American Heart Association, just as Charles had specified. The $100,000 had been transferred to Jennifer, who had used part of it as a down payment on a house and put the rest into savings for her future children's education. I hadn't spoken to Andrew since that confrontation in my foyer, though I'd heard through Jennifer that he and Melissa were having marriage problems. Apparently, when the money disappeared, so did some of Melissa's enthusiasm for their relationship. I felt sad about that, but not guilty. Their marriage had been built on greed and entitlement, and when those foundations crumbled, there hadn't been anything real left to hold them together. "Mrs. Monroe," Tommy's voice brought me back to the present. "There's someone here to see you." I looked up from the files to see Jennifer standing in the doorway, but she wasn't alone. Behind her was a man I didn't recognize, tall, maybe in his mid-60s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. He was wearing work clothes and holding a coffee cup from the shop down the street. "Mom, I'd like you to meet David Sullivan. He's the contractor who's been working on my house." David stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mrs. Monroe, it's a pleasure to meet you. Jenny's told me a lot about you and what you've accomplished here." I shook his hand, noticing the calluses that spoke of years of skilled work. "Nice to meet you, David. Jennifer's told me you're doing beautiful work on her place." "I try my best," he smiled, and I liked the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about a business matter. I've heard wonderful things about Monroe Construction, and I've got a project coming up that might be too big for me to handle alone. I was wondering if you'd be interested in discussing a partnership. 6 months ago, I would have automatically deferred to someone else to make that kind of decision. Now, I found myself genuinely interested in hearing his proposal. What kind of project? Historic renovation? A 1920s mansion in Newton that's being converted into luxury condos. The owner wants to preserve all the original architectural details while updating the electrical, plumbing, and HVAC. It's exactly the kind of challenging high-end work that Monroe Construction is known for. I felt a surge of pride. Monroe Construction was known for high-end work. Charles would have been so pleased to hear that. "Tommy," I called, "do you have a few minutes to join this conversation?" The three of us spent the next hour discussing the project details, timeline, and logistics. It was exactly the kind of complex job that would showcase our skills and bring in substantial revenue. By the end of the meeting, we'd agreed to submit a joint proposal. After David left, Jennifer lingered behind. "So," she said with a mischievous grin, "what did you think of David? He seems like a skilled contractor with a good reputation." "Why?" "Mom, Jennifer gave me the same look she used to give me when I was being deliberately obtuse. He's single, he's kind, he's successful, and he couldn't stop smiling when he was talking to you. I felt my cheeks grow warm. Jennifer, I'm not looking for... Dad said you should be open to dating if you met someone who made you happy, she interrupted gently. And David asked me 3 times if you were seeing anyone before he agreed to come here today. I stared at my daughter. He did? He did. And he asked if you might be interested in having dinner with him sometime. I told him he'd have to ask you himself, but that I thought you might say yes. The idea of dating still felt strange, even though Charles had specifically encouraged it in his letter. But there had been something comfortable about talking to David, something easy and natural that I hadn't expected. I don't know, honey. It's only been 6 months since your father died. Mom, Dad's been gone 6 months, but you've been alone for longer than that. He was sick for almost a year before he died, and I know you spent most of that time taking care of him instead of taking care of yourself. She was right. Charles's heart problems had developed gradually, and I'd spent months driving him to doctor appointments, managing his medications, and worrying about his health. I'd put my own needs aside to focus on caring for him, the same way I'd put my own needs aside for most of our marriage to focus on caring for our family. Think about it, Jennifer said, naïve, kissing my cheek. You deserve to be happy, Mom. You deserve to have someone who appreciates how amazing you are. After she left, I sat in Charles's old office, my office now, and thought about everything that had changed since that terrible day in the lawyer's conference room. I'd gone from being a grieving widow who felt lost and helpless to being a successful business owner who was confident in her abilities and excited about the future. The business was thriving. We'd completed 8 projects in the past 6 months, all on time and under budget. Word was spreading about the quality of our work, and we had more requests for estimates than we could handle. I'd hired 2 additional crew members and was considering expanding into larger commercial projects. More importantly, I discovered parts of myself I never knew existed. I was good at managing people, good at solving problems, good at making decisions under pressure. I enjoyed the challenge of complex projects and the satisfaction of seeing them through to completion. I liked being respected for my knowledge and expertise, instead of being treated like someone who needed to be taken care of. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Monroe Construction. This is Patricia. Mrs. Boy. Monroe, this is Mr. Hayes. I have some news I thought you'd want to hear. My heart skipped a beat. After the will contest, I'd hoped I was done dealing with legal matters for a while. What kind of news? Andrew came to see me today. He wants to know if there's any way he can... Well, he wants to know what it would take to repair his relationship with you. I was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. After 6 months of silence, Andrew was finally reaching out. But was it genuine remorse, or was it another manipulation? Did he say why? He said he's been doing a lot of thinking since his marriage ended, and he realizes he made some terrible mistakes. He asked if the offer to write an apology letter was still open, even though he can't inherit the money anymore. An apology letter. After all this time, after losing his inheritance and his marriage, Andrew was finally willing to apologize. Mr. Hayes, what do you think? In your professional opinion, does this seem genuine? Mrs. Monroe, I've known your family for 15 years, and I've seen Andrew at his best and his worst. I can't speak to his motivations, but I will say that he seemed humbled, different than he was 6 months ago. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet office and tried to imagine what an apology from Andrew might look like. Would it be sincere, or would it be another attempt to manipulate me into giving him what he wanted? And more importantly, was I ready to forgive him? I thought about Charles's words in his letter, about not letting Andrew's betrayal make me bitter or fearful. I thought about the strength I'd found in myself over the past 6 months, the confidence I'd gained in my own judgment and abilities. Maybe I was strong enough now to hear Andrew's apology without being swayed by it. Maybe I was secure enough in my own life to consider forgiveness without giving up my independence. Or maybe I wasn't ready yet, and that was okay too. I picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Hayes's number. Mr. Hayes, it's Patricia Monroe. If Andrew wants to write that letter, tell him I'll read it, but make it clear that an apology doesn't automatically restore our relationship. He broke my trust, and earning it back, if that's even possible, will take time and consistent actions, not just words. I'll tell him, Mr. Hayes said. And Mrs. Monroe, I think you're handling this exactly right. As the sun set over Boston, I locked up the office and walked to my car, feeling proud of the day's work. Tomorrow I'd be back here early, reviewing proposals and managing projects and making decisions that affected a dozen employees and their families. Tomorrow I'd be Patricia Monroe, successful businesswoman. Tonight, I was just Patricia, a woman who had survived betrayal and grief and come out stronger on the other side. A woman who was open to new partnerships and new friendships and maybe even new love. A woman who had learned that it's never too late to discover who you really are when you stop letting other people tell you who you should be. I drove home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, past the coffee shop where Charles and I used to have breakfast, past the park where we'd raised our children. Everything looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but I saw it all differently now, not as memories of a life that was over, but as the foundation for a life that was just beginning. Charles had been right. I was going to be more than okay. I was going to be extraordinary.